ما فيش صوت. لا هو الآن في. مرحبا. أنا بس حابة أذكر إن في عندنا ريسبشن باستضافة السفارة الهولندية في هذه القاعة الساعة 6:30. بالعدالة الانتقالية في اليمن ورسم المسار. تفضل.
شكرا.
And charting the path.
Thank you very much for being here. Assalamu alaikum. I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in English. My name is Marieke Wierda, and I'm the Deputy Ambassador for the Netherlands to Yemen. That's better. Yes, thank you for coming. I'm the Deputy Ambassador of the Netherlands to Yemen. My name is Marieke Wierda, and I'm very happy to moderate this panel today. I want to do it a bit different than the other plenary panels. We have a large panel. I'm going to introduce them in a minute. But I want to leave opportunity for you to participate. So I'm going to ask them each one question, and then I'm going to invite the floor to ask questions so that we make it a bit more participatory. When the conference was being organized, there was some discussion on why is transitional justice so prominent in the conference of Sana'a Center. Why is it so important? And why are there, I think, 7 sessions on transitional justice at the conference? I think part of this panel is supposed to help to answer that question. Because we've seen in different countries around the world that, in fact, often victims of conflicts are demanding their rights to truth, to justice, and to reparations and non-repetition. They are demanding their rights, and we wonder, will it be the same in the context of Yemen? Because Yemen has experienced both dictatorship and conflict, and there are many victims of this conflict. But another question may be why? Why are we discussing this now? Because there's not a peace process already ongoing. The conflict is still going on. Should we discuss it now? But one can't think of Syria, where for many years, of course, the same question could be asked. Why discuss it now? And then all of a sudden, a moment arrives and the concept needs to be implemented. So we are here, I think, to give a bit of content to that discussion. I know it's an important discussion for many of you, but we're very lucky to have this panel. So we have 6 speakers, and as I said, I will ask each of them a question. I will introduce you when I ask the question to you, so that people remember who I'm asking. And they each have important perspectives. So I'm going to start with you, Hala. Now, Hala Sultan Al-Qirshi is a judge. She's a founding member of the Association of the Families of the Disappeared. She's deputy head of the Supreme Court, and she's also a member of the Higher Education Committee. And Hala, to you, my question would be, you are a representative of victims of the conflict, and how do you look at this concept of transitional justice, and what does it mean to you?
مساء الخير. أول تصحيح، أنا عضو اللجنة العليا للانتخابات وكدرجة نائب رئيس المحكمة العليا وليس
Committee on Election, not Education. As for the concept of TJ, of course my father disappeared back in 78, and I was then 10 years old. And the dream has always been there to meet him, or at least to hear something about him and his whereabouts. It's a dream that remained with us for 45 years. So the concept of a TJ for me as one of the victims of enforced disappearance is to know, at least just a matter of knowledge, just a piece of news, what happened, period. What happened? What about his last moments? I mean, my father, his whereabouts, where his body is buried. So these are things that are very simple
يمكن لأي شخص عادي إنه يعرف
for any layman or commoner
والد
that would want to know about his or her father, brother, spouse, etc.
بالنسبة
So, this is as far as your question is concerned with what do I want. I want to rewrite history because my father, probably some of you know him,
مناضل وكان له
has always been involved in the national struggle, and he had a role in the 70-day siege incident. And of course, he's a victim of a political conflict indeed. So we need to set the history and the record straight, to fix history, to reform the institution, and to prevent the same persons from assuming the same positions so that they can repeat the very same violations perpetrated then. However,
مبدأ المحاسبة
when it comes to accountability,
أنا ممكن وهذه دائما أنا ما
and this is always something I raise, that personally, and this is my firm conviction and belief, personally, when it comes to accountability,
أسامح في حالة
I can forgive, but only
قال حقيقي
if there was a genuine transition into a civic society, with the introduction of genuine justice and reforms, so that Yemen can move forward and transition into a new stage of building and development. But I shall never relinquish my demand to reveal the truth, to rewrite history, reform institutions, and
طبعا نحن كأسرة مخفي كنا المتابعات ما قبل 2011 كانت متابعات
victims of enforced
شخصية
disappearances.
لكل أسرة
It
تتابع
has always
حول
been based
المخفي
on personal initiative. Each and every household they follow, or family they follow, on the whereabouts and the fate of their loved ones who went into disappearance. After the February 2011 revolution, and we here to commend An-Nida, the newspaper, in order to collate and gather information about the victims of enforced disappearances, and also Shaqa'iq, or female sisters of a forum, which launched almost a legal commission to follow up on the affairs. During the day, this was during the days of the Ali Saleh's regime. And also we launched an association for the families of the victims of enforced disappearance. This was back in March 2011. So this association or entity was concerned with bringing together the aggrieved, the suffering, the lost ones, the seekers, seeking justice in its simplest form. Whereabouts? Where is the gravesite? What's the fate? Is he still alive? Is he dead? So we gathered based on a humane bond that is common. We disregarded political affiliations or political epochs or eras engaged, or regional and geographical affiliations. We represented the entire spectrum of Yemen, and we formed ourselves, and we had a database with the questionnaire forms and templates that were filled in by the loved ones, by the family members of the victims, the last date he or she was seen, last place they were reported to have visited, etc. Given the scarcity of the information that people have, and given the non-responsiveness by the state agencies, the security agencies in particular, of course, like the political security agency, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, they refrained from disclosing any information about the victims of enforced disappearance. And so we prepared the database and the files for 2,000 persons. And then came the war. And then the entire homeland was pushed into forced disappearance, figuratively speaking. And so we had to forget about our own personal cases, and we have to struggle for the case of our homeland, the country. But still, we wanted to lay down the foundation for TJ and build on whatever is available in reality. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for sharing this story, and I think it illustrates really the importance of the topic. But some people may ask, but what could this look like in Yemen in particular? What is the cultural context of Yemen? And there I want to ask you, Sheikh Khalid Al-Kathiri. You're from Hadramaut, I believe. You're a tribal leader. And what are your thoughts on how a transitional justice process in Yemen could be informed by tribal or customary traditions of Yemen. Please, you have the floor.
شكرا أستاذة ماريكا. بالنسبة للعرف القبلي أو العدالة الانتقالية في العرف القبلي أود هنا أن أشير إلى نقطة مهمة
And the affiliation therein. One key point is the following. All tribes in Yemen are the ones paying the dear price for the war. Tribes and tribesmen. And of course, we have the prior accumulative grievances of the past decades, ever since the revolution until this very recent conflict and war. And up to the and those who always mobilize and suffer are the tribesmen because of the accumulated grievances as a result of historic legacy or legacy conflicts, and that's why they're mobilizing and pushing everyone in either direction of the two parties to the conflict, the Houthi or the other side. So it's an accumulation and a culmination of prior grievances. That's why TJ is a necessity. And of course, according to tribal norms, it should take place after reconciliation. But a key point here, because of the prior grievances that were left unsettled, mobilization and pushing people either way to join either party in the war is taking place. That's why reconciliation, as I see it, is the key pillar and anchor for TJ. And in tribal norms and customary law, it's of paramount importance. Reconciliation in tribal notions, we have something called sulh, which means reconciliation, and i.e. it destroys but also builds. So you whenever you reach a kind of reconciliation between the different tribes, it deletes the prior grievances and builds on the new terms and conditions. And when you made reference to the fact that I'm from Hadramaut, we have an example. We have something called Sulh al-Jaramis in Hadramaut, which is a customary. Ingram's reconciliation, because of this is due the days of the British mandate. And of course, the guarantor of that reconciliation agreement or pact was Britain or the UK. Hence it is called Ingram's. And at the end of the day, when it was effected and the UK forced everyone to respect it, the very first 5 years we saw no conflict, and Hadramaut started its civic renaissance that we see here, and people decided to go for the civic state. But the leeway, the entrance was based on the reconciliation as a key anchor in the tribal norms. And the other side of the story is the issue of reparation. Reparation in tribal traditions is of paramount importance. How to compensate the victims. Of course, the tribal norms have already laid down many foundations, customary norms, laws, rules. I will not go over them in details or directly, because verdicts and judgments could change and rules could change from one area to another. But at least we have the foundation. We have for many of the norms that are often solicited or resorted to, with the basic goal is to stop or contain any conflict between the tribes, and at the same time seek reparation. So that's why the tribal customary norms and traditions could be one instrument inter alia, through forming other committees, of course, but it could be a tool or an instrument inter alia to deal with the conflict. For instance, recently we have the January 13th incidents, the ramifications of which we're still suffering from up till this very day politically in the south, because the spillover effect two governorates and then antagonizing one governorate against the other, or pitching one governorate against the other. So TJ has to be kick-started as part of an inclusive, holistic reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think both speakers raised many issues that we want to come back to, because they're very profound, I think, issues that you're laying on the table. But to give each one a chance, and then I'm sure the audience will want to engage you also. Ghanem, you are both the Assistant Secretary General of the Nasserite Party, but you're also a member of the Consultation and Reconciliation Committee, which may have a mandate, of course, to deal with this subject. And you're also, I think, within that committee, on a subcommittee dealing with transitional justice. Can you tell us a little bit about your work on this issue and how you look at transitional justice from the CRC? بس الصوت.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, I would like to start by thanking you for this opportunity to discuss transitional justice. And this is a topic that will institutionalize or create an institutional approach for community safety and peace, and ensure that the conflict is not repeated. And we are in dire need in Yemen for this process, a transitional justice process. The topic of transitional justice was first discussed during the National Dialogue Conference. And there were many disagreements between the various political actors, and these disagreements are still there, of where do we start the process, where does the process's mandate start. Some wanted to have transitional justice starting from 2011 and only focusing on the grievances from 2011 on. And there were some who said, let's work on reconciliation rather than transitional justice. And we know that reconciliation should be at the last stage of transitional justice. You cannot have real forgiveness and reconciliation unless you go through all of the processes of transitional justice. And there was disagreement within the Transitional Justice Working Group in the National Dialogue Conference on the processes that Yemen would need to go through when it comes to transitional justice. After which we went into war, and like my dear friend Hala said, now it's no longer individuals who have been forcibly disappeared, but the country as a whole. We're no longer talking about violation of the rights of individuals, but violations of the right of Yemen and Yemenis, going down through cycles of violence and hateful rhetoric and incitement and sectarian and geographic discrimination, and we are still going down this cycle to much worse places. So when we talk about transitional justice, while the conflict is still ongoing, it's as if we're trying to put the carriage before the horse. For us to start talking about transitional justice, the state needs to be stable. State institutions would need to be stabilized, and the judicial system would also need to be reformed. We would need a judicial system that is just and operates with integrity. And there were many concerns that the politicians and the political actors had on the issue of transitional justice. And the main concerns were that there might be retributory acts by one side against the others. There were concerns that this would only lead to a renewal of the cycle of violence because of the retribution and revenge attacks. This would only renew the violence. And even now, during the conflict, there are actors who had committed violations, whereas others had grievances and they were victims. But now, due to the lengthy and protracted conflict, everyone has committed violations and everyone is a victim at the same time. And I believe that if the intentions were sound and we work towards, after achieving peace and rebuilding state institutions, if we want to build a Yemen that is stable, it is important for us to open this door, the door of transitional justice, and everyone needs to be held accountable. to at least let's say, start with uncovering the truth. For us as Yemenis with the tribal customs, if the truth is uncovered, this can help move along with reconciliation and forgiveness. We have examples from other countries and contexts as well. I have seen examples where the victims and the perpetrators of their violations were sitting next to each other and were able to reconcile. The victims would be telling their story, and the person next to them would say, I'm the person that committed this. I'm the reason that their spouse or their child was killed. And just like Sheikh Muhammad said, we also have tribal customs that might help support this process, that might help ensure this forgiveness and reconciliation, which after uncovering the truth and after assessing the repeated cycles of political violence in Yemen, this will ensure that we don't go back to the cycle of new violence. And the political actors or the power structures in Yemen, as I've said, have all committed these violations. And there are victims that they are responsible for, while at the same time they are also victims. And I think this will play a major role, this leads to the need of us sitting back and assessing the cycles of conflicts and violence that we have gotten to, and also working on rewriting its history, because victors usually write the history, and they write it in the way that is in their interest. And we're now dealing with generations of Yemeni children and Yemeni youth who have been marginalized and excluded, especially those in the areas under the control of the Houthis. We'll see that the curriculums in these areas have changed. And even against the two revolutions of Yemen, the September and October revolutions, history is being taught in a different manner. The truth is being hidden, and there's an attempt to raise a generation of people who are ignorant of their own history. And that's where the importance of transitional justice comes in. We are in dire need of it, of all of its stages, from uncovering the truth to accountability to reparations and to memorializing the victims in our national memory, and ensuring that there are mechanisms that are put in place to ensure that these cycles of violence do not continue, so that we can start rebuilding a Yemen of the future, a country that has gone behind whenever I visit any other country, I feel a sense of loss and disappointment. When will we finally end the conflict and start working on developing our country? We're still producing further and further conflicts, and not just the one we are in. Has the time not come for us to end this conflict and to rebuild Yemen like other countries are building themselves? I think the time has come for us to do that, and all politicians and political actors need to be honest with themselves and need to be honest with their history. And everyone is guilty of this, and there is not a single entity or group that is not guilty of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see already from the audience, people want to join the conversation. But I just want to still give a chance to our other speakers. I just want to ask, Nico, you're the Human Rights Watch researcher for Yemen. And Human Rights Watch, of course, works on accountability for Yemen and has for many years. But how do you look at this issue? And do you see that now is the time to work on an issue like this? Please.
Thank you so much for the question and for having me on this panel today. I think my colleagues have already highlighted the answer to this question in many ways. I don't think there's an opportunity to wait when it comes to transitional justice. Transitional justice is not just, there's not one form of transitional justice. And again, this has already been highlighted on this panel. It doesn't need to come in just the form of a court system adjudicating a specific this was the violation that occurred, and therefore we need to take this set of measures. Transitional justice can be so many things. It can come in the form of tribal mediation, it can come in the form of courts, it can come in the form of international mechanisms, it can come in the form of reparations, of truth and reconciliation. It can happen in so many different ways. But I think what's extremely, extremely evident, and everyone on this panel so far has brought it up many times, and for the last day and a half, we've all heard people bring it up many times, is that there are many, many grievances in Yemen that have not been addressed. And there have been decades of grievances that have gone unaddressed and that have allowed cycles of violence and conflict to continue in the country. I've only had the privilege of working with civil society in Yemen for the last 7 years. And in that time, it's been extremely evident that part of the reason the conflict even exists now is based on prior grievances. And even today, the conflict has dragged on for too many years. The peace process is far too slow, and we're already seeing new forms of conflict emerge, which is what my colleague had just said. You're already seeing new forms of violence be perpetrated and new grievances emerging. And so, I think to answer the question more directly, I don't think we can wait. It doesn't need to take on one single form, but there's a lot of different forms of transitional justice that can take place before Yemen is in a full, inshallah soon, in a full state of peace. I think there are a lot of reparations that need to be made by a lot of not just local authorities, but also by a lot of international states that have contributed to the conflict and perpetrated a lot of violations throughout the conflict. A lot of that can happen right now. People have been documenting these violations for many years. People are well aware of a lot of these violations. They've been investigated. A lot of those victims need to be repaid so that they can move on with their lives and actually be able to restart their livelihoods. People need their homes back. People need money to rebuild their homes. People need money to rebuild water infrastructure and very basic things so that they can even just live in and just have the basic means to be living to begin with. So I do think it's really critical that this happens now and is not simply pushed aside as a concept that can just come after peace, because Yemen is dynamic, the world is dynamic, things are constantly changing, and if we wait too long, too many people are going to spend too many years without the basic means of life at this point, and who've suffered for far too long to begin with. At Human Rights Watch, we also have done research in the past on looking at countries across the world to understand, does justice need to come after peace, or is it actually a necessary precursor to peace? And we found that it's actually a very helpful ingredient to achieving peace to begin with. And this is looking at dozens of countries across the world, not just in the Yemen context. And I think that much that lesson should be taken into the context of Yemen as well. I think a lot of people have an idea of transitional justice as a very specific thing that comes from the international community or Western governments or whatever. But again, everyone on this panel has really highlighted that it's a really large part of the fabric of Yemeni society to begin with. It just depends on how we're thinking about it and looking at it. And I do think there's a critical opportunity right now to be incorporating different forms of that justice process into a lot of the peace talks to begin with, into local communities, and then also on the international stage as well. International states have absolutely dropped the ball on seeking any form of justice in Yemen. And while I think it's really important for us to continue talking about all of the different means for local mediation efforts and government-led efforts, Yemeni-led efforts to also be the most integral part of this process, I do think it's really key to point out that the conflict in Yemen and the grievances in Yemen are not just with local actors. There were many different states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the UK, the US, Iran, Western governments that contributed arms to this conflict that are not going to be able to be a part of a local justice process. That requires the international community to also be stepping up and doing the work that needs to be done to actually allow Yemen to move forward in a way that allows them to actually live in peace. And so I think these things cannot be ignored in the way that they have been. They need to be given the time and space and energy that is required, and there needs to be very many aspects of this that are incorporated today and now by many people in this room as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico. Next, I want to ask Sergio Jaramillo. Now, for those of you who don't know him, he has actually been the architect of the peace process in Colombia. And so he devised and negotiated the talks on behalf of the government. And Colombia is, these days, maybe the country that's implementing the most extensive and sophisticated transitional justice system. So we're very keen to hear from him what this may mean for Yemen and whether he can reflect a little bit on what your experience means for what you've heard from Yemen. Please.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all. Thanks to the Sana Center for this invitation. Delighted to be here on this panel. I'm basically a Martian here. I don't really know very much about Yemen. I've never been to Yemen. I've read the basics. But I did want to begin with a message of hope. In Colombia, we had a very, very long war. It lasted over 50 years, which produced hundreds of thousands, millions of victims. Actually, we have over 8 million registered victims of internal displacement, second largest population in the world after Syria. We have close to, according to the Truth Commission, 500,000 dead out of the conflict, 120,000 forcibly displaced, 50,000 kidnapped. And if you'd asked anybody in 2010 whether they thought this would ever end, they would say no, this is never going to end. And it did end. So it is possible to bring a war to an end, but it is critical for the population, for the country, to take control and to run its own peace process. This is my view. I think Yemen is very lucky to have so much international support, is very lucky to have such strong UN team at the moment, but the only way you're going to have peace in Yemen is if leadership at all levels, from the politicians to the grassroots, everyone mobilizes around this and takes control and tells the international community what it is you need. That's what we did. We told the international community what we needed for our own process. And the key to this is to start early. So in terms of issues of transitional justice, I don't believe myself, and it's not the Colombian experience, that you need to just kind of sit back and wait for a great peace agreement, and then you talk about transitional justice. No, you have to start very early. And I would say I'll just mention very quickly 5 or 6 things. One is to first have clarity about what it is you want to achieve. What's the concept? And actually, we almost never talked about transitional justice. We talked about victims and the rights of victims. And I think this is a more effective way, at least for Colombia. I know it's an established and accepted concept in the case of Yemen, at least since the NDC. But if you talk about transitional justice, it's very abstract. It could be anything. And also, it kind of scares people away straight away. Yesterday, there was an interesting session with politicians about transitional justice, and there's no chance whatsoever that politicians are going to agree on some kind of transitional justice system. It's not going to happen. But if you say no, it's about the victims and their rights, and we all of us have to respond to the victims, then it's a different perspective, and it makes it easier. That's what happened in our case. Second, you have to have some consensus about what those rights are, and if you're able, put them in a law. That's what we did in Colombia. We passed, in the middle of a conflict, a law on victims' rights, which included a reparations program, even if we didn't have a peace agreement before. And the third thing that we did is, that society did, is that victims' organizations mobilized. It's very, very important for victims to be mobilized, because when victims mobilize, they put the issue of their rights on the agenda. This is, again, one of the reasons why you cannot wait for a peace agreement. You have to start early to demand your rights, so that when we actually got to the negotiation, for you, those of you, I mean, most of you, there's no reason you should know anything about Colombia, as I don't know much about Yemen. But basically, the war started in 1964. There were 3 failed attempts at peace negotiations, big ones, until we started in 2012 secret talks with the FARC insurgency, which was the biggest guerrilla ever in the history of Latin America and the oldest. And I was actually head of the government delegation, and we were doing the secret talks to arrive at a framework agreement that included an objective for the talks, some rules, but also the agenda. And we said in this secret talks, we said, look, we need to have a point on victims. This is, by the way, the first time ever that in a peace negotiation there has been a point on victims' rights. Mm-hmm. And we said, there is no way we can negotiate with you now in the current context, because victims have mobilized, there's a victims' law, there is no way Colombians would accept a peace deal that does not include victims. So this is why you really need to start early. The next thing we did was to make sure that there was intense victim participation in what the deal would look like. And that meant not only organizing a large conference, as you know a lot about in Yemen, with the experience of 2012 and so forth, but we actually, this is also the first time this has happened, we actually invited delegations of victims to go and address directly the negotiating table. Not picked by us, the government, or the FARC, but by the church, the UN, and a major university. So over 2 months, victims came to talk to us and tell us what they expected. And this was very, very powerful. And then the last thing is that, so we set up, on the basis of all of this, we agreed to a system, which you could call of transitional justice, a system of truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition, a very important concept, which is very relevant here. Non-repetition, because you're doing all of this to make sure it does not happen again, or to contribute. And so the last point is you need to institutionalize this in some way. Now, I don't recommend the Colombian formula, because the Colombian formula is very complex and heavy, and it's a different country with a different context. We're a very legalistic country with lots of courts, but there are elements of what we did that are relevant. For example, the importance that the courts understand what you're doing, so when you finish, it's accepted by your own courts, and by the international courts, by the way. We're the first country that set up a transitional justice system that the International Criminal Court considered to be in compliance with Article 17 of the Rome Statute. Mm-hmm. So this is something you need to think about. And there are some particular things we did which I think may be relevant to Yemen. For example, for each one of these things, so for truth, we set up a truth commission. For justice, we set up a special tribunal. For reparations, we had a law. But we also set up a special unit to look for the disappeared. So within the Colombian state, there is today a unit, and by the way, it's an extrajudicial exercise. It's not part of the judiciary, and whose sole purpose is to look for the 120 forcefully disappeared. So that's what we've done, and whatever we can modestly share or help Yemen, we are ready to. We just set up with my old team. I had a position in the Colombian government called the High Commissioner for Peace, and I had something called the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace. That's the team that did the negotiations, and with them we set up a foundation in Colombia last year called Acordemos, and what we're trying to do is help others a little bit, because a lot of people helped us when we were negotiating. Marike came in 2014 and helped us with all of her knowledge of the ICC and all of this, and helped us understand. So just as we got a lot of help, we want to help others, and we're ready to help you in whichever way we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm sure there may be questions about that extensive experience that the Colombians have, but thank you for sharing it, Sergio. Yazid, last but by no means least, can you maybe tell us a bit more practically what can we actually do from a civil society perspective to start taking steps now down this road? Tfaddal.
Thank you very much, Marike. It's always a pleasure to join such kind of distinguished panel. I'll speak in Arabic. دعيني بالبداية أشير إلى ما ذكر الزملاء الأعزاء. نحن كيمنيين عانينا كثيرا من دوامة الصراع المتكررة منذ ستينات القرن الماضي لم يكاد
of recurrent conflicts. Since the 1960s, we almost didn't miss one decade without having to find our country slipping into chaos, violence, and leaving behind scores of thousands of victims without even justice looming in sight, without finding a place for justice in any political settlement, whether brokered by local entities or through regional brokering. And as the colleague has said about Yemen's experience with the TJ, is a nascent one launched in the NDC, which actually constituted the very first opportunity for three key components of Yemen that have long been disregarded in Yemen. I'm talking about the civil society, the youth, and women. Those three forces joined the meetings, and the NDC tried to find not only a foothold, but also a leadership position in the front lines in order to challenge the traditional conventional political forces that have always decided to silence the voices of others in order to achieve their best interest and to achieve their political gains at the expense of the voices of the people who has always been the number one victim. The NDC, as mentioned, was the very first experience of the like. Despite the momentum it gathered then, but there were a group of imbalances simply because the political forces in power tried to influence it and to intervene, listing the issues of national dimension or nature in order, in a way, trying to dilute the very important topics, including the transitional justice. And of course, there was an ambitious ceiling that was probably more than should be have been hoped for then. And such discussions and such fora, either run by the Sana Center or other initiatives and other organizations that are trying to pitch again TJ, are daring, courageous initiatives to reveal how aware is the civil society, how aware are the youth, and to show that society does realize that any peace agreement or settlement shall be rump or rushing through a political settlement. This will be rump as long as it does not take into consideration listening to the voices of the victims of war, as long as it does not address to rectify the legacy violations, and it will be only just another gate for an even fiercer round of violence. Well, given this increasing awareness of the civil society, what we need, and we are working on it by the way, in such fora and meetings with voices that are trying to raise the sound of TJ high, there is one pressing need that we're trying to meet, which is the following: to take stock and review what we have acquired. Yes, it's a limited experience. We have the NDC outcomes. You might agree or disagree. That's a different story, but it's still it's a reference document that we can always revisit and consider its content and its contribution to the future of Yemen if the civil society is allowed to go over it. And also the TJ law remained a bill and was not enacted then. And now we need the civil society to meet, go and conduct an overhaul of these documents within the current context. And we, as Yemenis, to think as a civil society in our capacity as young and women as well, and then to share a vision in the situation of no peace and no war, and the political stalemate. Given all this bleak situation that we are yet to find the light at the end of the tunnel, given the above, the civil society has to move and to try to go over all this kind of documents and literature until the parties to the conflict decide to relaunch the political talks again. Our message should be clear and ready to convey, to tell them in a unanimous voice, this is the transitional justice we want to see. We cannot move forward without addressing the grievances and the mistakes of the past. What we're doing is part and parcel of this initiative, and we can always build on the prior legacy experiences of the civil society over the course of the last 2 years, when 70 of them met and launched the Justice and Reconciliation Declaration, as it was dubbed. in order to present the TJ in a more developed and consolidated fashion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yazid from Sana'a Center. I think now it's time to open it up to the audience. I also, in particular, invite people who, because many of the speakers obviously believe in this idea, but if there are among you who don't believe in it so strongly or who have another opinion, please come forward. But I'll start here with the gentleman and then in the front. Please, do we have a mic for? It's first this gentleman. He had his hand up a long time. Can you please identify yourself before you speak? Yeah.
Nabil Faqih, منتدى رواد التنمية.
Nabil Faqih from the Development Champions Forum. A question addressed to the panel, the issue of discrimination. Can we now, or is it now the appropriate time to think about banning discrimination based on faith, religion, or region? Because this is usually the starting point or the catalyst for retribution and vendettas. So if it was a religious or geographical based discrimination, it should be banned, because we cannot start with TJ. Should we start with TJ before addressing its root causes, which have accumulated over the courses of many years? They're not nascent or born yesterday, but across generations, particularly when it comes to discrimination based on religion or faith or doctrine or denomination. Thank you.
Identify whom you are asking the question to. That will be easier for the panel.
Dr. Rana.
To Dr. Rana.
First, and then back to the back. We take maybe 3 questions, then some answers, and then we'll go back to the floor. Please, and if you could introduce yourself.
Mahdi Mohammed Balghaith.
Mahdi Mohammed Balghaith, the Accountability Foundation for Human Rights from Marib. On behalf of myself and those who are attending, would like to express our solidarity with Ms. Hal Al-Qurashi, whose father was the victim of forced disappearance since she was 10 years old. What a pity. My question is as follows. Given the current context, how can the approved established mechanisms or available ones, how can they contribute to the revealing or uncovering the whereabouts of former detainees, given the fact that the war now prompted everyone to forget about the cases of the enforced disappearances like Ali Gannaf, Zohra, Sultan Al-Qurashi, who were victims of the former regime. Given the war now that is used also as a pretext to force many people into forced disappearances.
And then we'll...
Sorry, you said any question they should say for whom?
Yeah.
موجه لمن يعني؟
To Judge Hannah.
للقاضي هلا.
هي أيضا قاضية بحكم أنها قاضية.
Yes, because she's a judge as well. And as a form of solidarity, she's a victim and a judge. That's why I aptly addressed the question to her.
This gentleman here. Yeah. I know. Next round, inshallah, some women.
محمد
Bates from the STC. I believe, first of all, we need to explain and interpret the meaning of the genuine notion, noble notion of the TJ, or tolerance and forgiving. I believe reconciliation prior to TJ is a matter of conduct, behavior, awareness, and approach before using it as a mantra or a slogan. Everyone is repeating it as a mantra or a slogan, but we don't know what does it mean, and it is yet to be translated into an awareness level and implementation through conduct and behavior. Some people here will talk on behalf of justice and reconciliation, and then leave the room, might write a report that would further fuel the conflict. First of all, we have to realize it's a matter of a level of awareness, a mindset, and a behavior before just pitching it in as a slogan. Also, many people say, let's come, let's do reconciliation as part of TJ. First of all, let's lay down the weapons and the daggers before we go into any talks about reconciliation and justice. It's not feasible to talk about reconciliation and tolerance and TJ and comes talking to you about it while holding his weapon, and at any moment in time he starts shooting at you. Here, regrettably, unfortunately, reality on the ground is totally different from what's being brought up and said in this room. It's the situation is disdainful, it's desperate. If we understand the concept, I don't want to be done injustice, nor do I want to do injustice to you. Only then we can achieve something, if we all emerge victorious from this type of justice. So yes, we can reach a solution, but if we come with a preset mindset that's one will beat the other, in this case justice will be elusive.
Thank you very much. I'm first going to go back to the speakers. I note that the last was a comment more than a question. But I'll first ask maybe Rana and Jajhala if you want to respond, and then anyone else who wants to comment.
طيب أنا سأبدأ من
Well, I'll comment on the colleagues' remarks from the STC. Yes, true. Let's lay down our arms and weapons first, i.e. let's stop the conflict. Only then we can think about justice. It is very difficult to think about TJ while we're still fighting in the conflict. So even us at the CRC, although I intentionally avoided talking about the CRC as an entity in my intervention, but even that, today we cannot even talk about transitional justice because our role at the CRC, we wanted the outset at least to consolidate the lines, as they say, and try to reconcile between the various antagonistic political powers under the umbrella of the IRG, or the legitimacy government. So even within the legitimacy government we have many opponents. We need at least to bring them to order before laying down the foundation for the institutionalization of the state, including the IRG controlled areas. So yes, I can never agree more. Let's stop the conflict and let's not threaten each other at gunpoint. As for Nabil Faqih's remark, whether or not do we have a vision or a strategy about banning discrimination based on faith or geographical affiliation, I believe we're over-obsessed with the conflict, how to bring it to an end, how to mitigate its impact. But that's our primary concern now. But we're talking about equal citizenship. In other words, this could be provided for in the Constitution, of the Republic of Yemen, even after the NDC. In the draft constitution, then all citizens are equal before the law, irrespective of their affiliation, law, religion, faith, etc. Then how we can enforce it? How can it be translated by the state in its institutions, education, methodology, operations? But I believe this is a constitutional article that should be observed, respected, and enforced. And we have no hope whatsoever unless we genuinely believe in it and implemented practice, and that we genuinely believe as Yemenis we're equal, irrespective of race, colors, doctrine, faith, affiliation, etc. Only then we can live together as equal citizens, rights and duties. And this should be constitutionalized and dedicated in the Constitution rather than be part of TJ. Please. First of all, thank you for your sympathy and solidarity. And I believe after the recent war and the enforced disappearance that has become so rampant in an extraordinary fashion, people came to learn what is enforced disappearance. In the past, personally, I've been in many situations when I talk about my father They say, oh, that was probably now he's dining with angels in heaven. Imagine that. I heard it from very senior officials as a response to the case. Do you still think he's still alive? I don't think so. And Lali Masusu, who used to be a female minister of human rights, when my father's name and Ali Qannab Zohra were brought, she said with cold shoulder, this is a very old, outdated. I told her, do you have the statute of limitation when it comes to human rights violation? That was my answer to her. So at least people are just beginning to understand what is enforced disappearance. As for the mechanisms, we had a parallel session in which we addressed the judicial reform and with regards to the mechanisms that we can help establish as of today. For instance, forensic medicine and development of this field of knowledge, because after peace we can talk about exhumation of the dead bodies from mass graves, etc. But also such associations of families of victims of enforced disappearance, and also the association of the mothers of victims of enforced disappearance and detainees, Mizmet Al-Haj, she's here. Such associations are already up and running mechanisms that are striving and trying to be one of the inherent basics of the transitional justice once we start to roll it out.
Yes, and I want to pay particular tribute to Amat Salam Al-Haj with her work on mothers of abductees, which I think is very, very important to mention. Thank you. We have a lady here in the front, then I saw a lady over there, and then I'll take one more before going back to the speakers, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the panelists and the speakers. My question is going to be to first, I'm Sabah Subay. I'm a lawyer and a defender of victims of human rights violations. I'm going to speak to Sergio about the Colombian experience. I had 3 questions, if you'll allow, and I hope even if we get an answer, even in brief. In Colombia, while as a country that has extensive experience in transitional justice, did you have specific laws that were drafted on transitional justice? My second question is, how did you deal with those who were missing or forcibly disappeared, especially with the large number that you spoke about? How were you able to work through this? And my third question is, were there cases that were referred to the ICC after these cases had gone through the local courts in Colombia? Thank you very much.
Very important questions. Won't be easy to answer. The lady over here, and then I'll take one more before going back to the panel. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, Shireen Yazbek, ABC Australia. I have just a question. Transitional justice, does it mean amnesty? I just want to tell to the Yemeni people, don't do the error we did in Lebanon. Amnesty, general amnesty, and then people, they do their own justice. And talking about Colombia, there is a very interesting place called Casa de la Memoria in Medellin. Is there a place in Yemen today to document, archive from now all the victims that disappeared? Because I think you should start now. I went to Syria last week, and I can tell you they're doing the justice on the street. As soon as they find a criminal, well, justice is done. So I think the most important in this justice is the victim. And I don't think that amnesty just I don't want to say forget about amnesty, but we did this in Lebanon, and you can understand what happened next.
Another one?
Oh, okay. But after that one over here.
مساء الخير للجميع. دكرة معتوق حسين.
Hello everyone, Dikra Hussein Ma'touq. I am a lawyer at the appellate court and a social activist. I thank everyone for their comments and for the interventions of the panelists. And I think we've discussed the theory about transitional justice and also hearing about experiences of other contexts. But I think our environment is very different. The context in Yemen is very different from other contexts. First, if there is a real will and a real desire to have transitional justice in Yemen, then confidence would need to be built. The victims and the victims' families would need to have trust in state institutions. How can I convince a mother? How can I convince a sister or a spouse of a victim, a daughter who has lost her father? How can I convince her that there will be a real transitional justice process when they don't trust state institutions? I tell them, let's work on transitional justice and reconciliation and forgiveness. We have this, the only people who have felt this are those who have borne the brunt of these violations. We can talk about the theory from all day, and we can talk about transitional justice and reconciliation and forgiveness or amnesty or anything, but we need to start with the step of building confidence and trust between victims and victims' families and institutions. And the second point is, how can we memorialize the victims and the martyrs so that we can try to find this can be a form of reparations for them morally before we even talk about reparations. Thank you.
Can I maybe have Abdullah Shaddad? Yes, please. Yeah.
سؤالي موجه لل
My question is to Rana Ghanem.
أيهما سيكون الأولى أو الابتداء
Which is more of a priority? Which will we start with? Transitional justice
الوطن أم من
with
أخفى
those who have lost, those who have led to the conflict, or those who are involved in the disappearance? And also a recommendation or a comment. There are many cases of violations that have been committed. Is there going to be a framework, a specific framework for the implementation of transitional justice or reconciliatory justice, or is this something that's going to take years for us to set these frameworks up with regards to those who are forcibly disappeared, those who were detained for years, those who were tortured, those who have left their detentions paralyzed or died in prison, or whose limbs had to be amputated due to landmines, those whose homes were destroyed, those who have been forced out of their homes in the areas that they reside in to other areas or forcibly displaced, those whose assets were frozen or confiscated for years. And these are all violations and crimes that were committed against individuals, whether they are whether this was against people who were at the time in the authority or those outside of it. And then secondly, Rana, you were a revolutionary against a regime that had been accused of committing violations, but today you are a part of the authority. You are a part of the power structure, and those who are in charge or your superiors in the government are those that you revolted against in the past. And so who's going to be implementing transitional justice in these cases? I don't need an answer for this question, but I want to say that the situation or the context in Yemen is a very complex one. If we look at just the past 60 years, there has not been a single 10-year stretch where Yemen has been stable in both parts, in north and the south. And so the situation in Yemen, maybe during the process of transitional justice, we might need 2 years with just focusing on how we can deal with this issue and in dealing with the creation of these frameworks. And sorry for taking too long in my intervention.
Want to speak. I'm briefly handing back to the panel, to people who asked questions, and then we'll do one final round. I see about 200 hands, but I'll manage that later, please.
I'll start with a question on Colombia. Thank you very much for the interest. But before I answer, just very quickly, the key point about amnesties and general amnesties was mentioned. And I want to raise it because the baseline in Colombia, and this is what we said in a very tough meeting with the leadership of the FARC guerrillas. We said, look, the baseline here is that there isn't going to be a general amnesty. That's it, because we're not going to ignore victims' rights. What are we going to do? How far can you go? Well, that's the question. How far can you go in truth, in justice, in reparations? You can see how far you go. But the baseline has to be no general amnesty, do your best to address the rights of victims. So the three-part question. First, on laws and legislation. We are world champions in producing laws and legislation. So we had, as I mentioned, before we started the negotiations, we had already passed a law of reparations, which enunciated in very clear ways what were the rights of victims. Once we had set up our transitional justice system, we not only passed a law, but we actually passed a constitutional amendment to make that part of the Constitution, to make sure it could not be changed, also as a guarantee for all of those who signed the agreement that this would not be changed. And then we had to pass more laws to develop each one of the components. And all of this was very closely supervised by the courts, especially by the Constitutional Court of Colombia, which is a very, very powerful court. It is probably one of the most activist courts in the world. But by doing that, we also had institutional buy-in. I mean, the courts felt they were part of the process, and they tightened some nuts and bolts, and they tweaked a few things, but they respected the agreement, and now it had all the backing of the system. So it made it stronger over time. And we had many ups and downs politically over the last 8-9 years in Colombia, and one of the reasons why the system survived is because it was incorporated into the constitution, the transitional justice system, and the courts supported it. Mm-hmm. On the question of forced disappearance, as I said, one of the things we agreed to in the peace agreement was a proposal that we made, it's actually an idea I proposed myself, was to create this special unit to look for the forcefully disappeared, which took quite a long time to get going. We learned from experience of others, what the International Committee of the Red Cross had done in Yugoslavia. This new organization, the International Commission on Missing Persons, they came to advise us as well. It took time to get going, but in the context of a peace agreement, it's much easier to do its work because people speak, but also because, and here's a key point that I wanted to raise, all of these measures are interlinked. For a transitional justice system to work, what you're trying to do is make sure there are connections and links between the various pieces. So if you're demanding from those who are going to a tribunal that in order to get a lenient sentence, they really have to contribute to the truth, one way they can contribute to the truth is by helping find the missing, for example. So it's part of a system. And lastly, the question on the ICC. Well, we have the world expert on this sitting to my right. And Colombia is a very interesting case because we really worked very closely with the ICC in the sense that we informed them. I mean, they weren't supporting the peace process, that's not their job. Mm-hmm. But they were informed. And we always said, look, there's not going to be a general amnesty because this goes against the Colombian law and constitution because we signed the Rome Statute. So actually, the ICC was a kind of hammer we used to push as far as we could with victims' rights and to say, well, look, this is the choice. If you don't want to do this, then this is what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. You choose. And this relationship became closer and closer to the point that the current prosecutor, Khan, was in Colombia a bit over 2 years ago and decided, and formally, for those who don't know, technically you're under preliminary examination in the ICC. This is the first thing. We had been under preliminary examination of the ICC since 2004 in Colombia. So for almost 20 years. And he actually formally closed this on the basis that he was satisfied with what the Colombian system had done. So it actually ended up being a kind of win-win. We used the ICC to get the strongest system possible, to get people to accept things that they don't really accept. No guerrilla had ever accepted to go before a tribunal, ever. And one of the arguments to make them accept is that your choice is to go to the ICC. And vice versa, the ICC had never acknowledged a transitional justice system as being compatible with the Rome Statute, which is what happened in Colombia. So it's still ongoing work. It's not done, and there's still risks and problems. But it was very important, this relation.
Thank you. Does anyone else, Rana, you want to say a few words maybe?
بداية أنا لسنا مع عفو عام. دائما العفو العام معناه أنه نضع رؤوسنا في الرمال ونقول خلاص عفو عام وعفى الله عما سلف.
There's an amnesty, may God forgive us all, and we move on. And this is only going to institutionalize future conflicts. If we do not give justice and are fair with the victims, that means that we won't be able to build a new state, one that is based on justice and equality. If we are not fair towards the victims of the ongoing and previous political conflicts. And so we must never think that a general amnesty needs to occur before we champion human victim rights and uncover the truth. A reconciliation based on transitional justice, and transitional justice reconciliation comes at the end of the process because the victims feel that they have gotten their due, that they feel satisfied with the truths that have been uncovered, and they feel that there have been reparations given to them and that their rights have been recognized. Then and only then can you say there is reconciliation after this process has occurred. But for us in Yemen, we need to benefit from these various experiences, from the experience of Colombia, from the experience of Morocco, Rwanda, of South Africa. However, we also need a localized, a Yemeni mechanism, one that is close to our own environment, the context that we are in with all of its specificities, and one that is also suitable for the various rounds of conflict. And I think every country is different in this regards. Every conflict is different. Every country builds a transitional justice mechanism that is suitable for their own needs and for their own context. And that's what we need to think about as Yemenis. How can we create a model that is purely Yemeni? It can learn from others, but it deals with, for example, the role of tribes, it deals with the local contexts, and it deals with the history of these ongoing and repeated conflicts. With regards to what should come first, of transitional justice for individuals or those who have caused damage, not to specific victims, but to the country as a whole, we as Yemenis are in a state of shock from what the Houthis have done. We've gone through many cycles of violence. Since 1986, was there anything worse than what Yemenis went through in 1986? With the enforced disappearance and also the enforced disappearances at the time of Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime. We've gone through many cycles of violence, but we as Yemenis, this is unprecedented. We have not seen what we are seeing today from the Houthis, with the blowing up of homes and the violation of basic human dignity, something that has not happened. Yemenis have felt like they are being humiliated, their dignity is being trampled on. Everyone has been displaced, academics, intellectuals, the private sector, politicians, everyone has been forced out, their property confiscated. The employees of international and local organizations, these organizations that are operating in broad daylight and based on the laws have been detained and have been disappeared. Anyone who says that what the Houthis are doing are wrong is detained, is tortured, is humiliated. And we've seen this. We have people here in the YF with us, people who were just recently released from Houthi detentions. And we've heard stories that we had never expected as Yemenis to hear occurring in Yemen. And so what we are seeing today is something that is unprecedented in Yemen's history. Ending the Houthi coup and confronting this coup is something that we need to take into account. And is there a framework that is ready, as you've asked? There isn't, no. What Dhikra mentioned, which is the importance of having victims' trust in state institutions, is important. That's important now because these institutions are extremely fragile. And how can victims trust them? And how can victims trust that these courts or these institutions will help them get justice? There is no model that is ready. We will need to rebuild it. We'll need to build it and create it, and to rebuild and reform state institutions and the judicial system for us to start thinking about transitional justice. Thank you.
Take only two more questions, I'm afraid to say, and then I'm also going to ask our panelists who haven't had a lot of chance to respond to questions to maybe give some final words or thoughts. but I'm going to take the gentleman with the hat because he's waiting a long time. And I'm sorry, I have to spread the questions a bit, so I'm going to take one from over there, the lady. I'm really sorry. I know many of you are experts in your own rights and have a lot to contribute.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا عندي سؤال.
Thank you very much. I had a question to our friend from Colombia.
هل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية
Did the United States support the process and the reparations in Colombia and in reconstruction? Because the United States played a large role, not just in Colombia, but all of the countries of Latin or South America.
We're being quite fast, so I'll take one or two more, just because the participation is so. So I'll take the lady and then here two more. Yeah, the two of you. But keep it short, please, if possible. Please introduce yourself.
صحفية. بدأت أفكر
I'm a journalist.
في خلال اليوم ما كنا نتكلم عن العدالة
Over the course of the day, when we started talking about TJ, I thought, or as we know at least, we have political divisions along partisan lines and sectarian lines as well as tribal ones. So does this mean that we need to solve the problems and address the root causes? The root causes start with the tribe because they were parties to the conflict as much as they were an aggrieved party. How feasible or possible to bring the tribes together to start partially solving the problems and the issues and then engage them in a dialogue with the politicians, sects and parties? Another point, the media is always being absented from the scene, although the media is the culprit more often than not by creating bigotry, creating prejudices, and the Houthis use the media as their first weapon in order to divide the nation and the country. So at least the media should come together in order to put an end to the partisan discourse. Because they can really influence thousands of followers. And if we still have influencers who can really dig deeper, we should solicit their help. Journalism, media, outlets. At least we should put an end to political divisions and try to find solutions for TJ.
One more here and one more here. Then I'm afraid I have to close it, and I'll ask specifically the speakers who haven't yet replied.
مجاهد القب من الساحل الغربي.
بالطبع.
Mujahid from the West Coast.
القانون هو
the law more often than not paves the way for the violation of the rights of millions, like during the days of the Imam Ahmad in 1948 and 1958 in the Tihama area in the west, south of Al-Hudaydah. Thousands were displaced then, and hundreds were detained and arrested in Hajjah, and the original inhabitants of the land were forced to relinquish their property to the treasury of the state then, and it was canonized into law. So the land they used to live on became part of the feudal system that was looted by the so-called then the Khalifa of the Muslim nation then. That was before 1962. Then it has become a law, and forgot about the victims that disappeared, who were forcefully disappeared. Now, with the advent of the Houthis, they retrieved their original title deeds of their ancestors, and they claimed that it was confiscated or expropriated, and that's why there should be restitution now of the property. And they reignited and vitalized the issue. So violation is now legal when they dedicate into law. So beware, when we think of enacting new laws, more often than not, violations become codified. Can you imagine that? And many people, the silent majority of the people, or whose voices and mouths are gagged. And they're suffering a lot simply because they're helpless segments of society. That's why we need to be really meticulous, more accurate, and pay attention to what has been forgotten in the realm of oblivion centuries and decades ago. We need to dig deep, but still the violation and injustice has been passed down across generations. And now they're just, and I find it strange that the STC representatives say these are just slogans.
Final question, and then we have to go back to the panel. And try to keep it short if possible.
دكتور نادر السقاف.
Nader al-Saqaf, director of the
العنصر الوحيد اللي رأيت إنه ممكن مفيد بالتجربة
the director of the office for the general office.
إعادة كتابة التاريخ تحتاج إلى الإدماج أكيد هي لكل مكونات.
General director of the Baha'i Affairs Office. One of the mechanisms could be functional through the CRC or follow something about that with the CRC. Can you make some kind of self-reflection? Now you have only 5 female members of CRC. Minorities have 0 representation in the CRC membership. Okay, 1.5 as you say. However, can you conduct a self-reflection exercise and the CRC could come up with a suggestion when you want to expand the membership to 50 to have more women representation, more minority representation, more youth representation?
Khalid and to Nico and to Yazid, and then the rest of you who still want to say, but all in 5 minutes, please, the whole thing. So 1 minute each, I'm afraid to say. Please.
شكرا. أول بالنسبة هل إمكانية
Thank you. Whether or not the tribes could come together under TJ, yes, there is a possibility to entertain such an idea. As I said, the accumulation of prior legacy grievances are responsible for that, and I know because I'm in the south, and I know what's going on in different governorates. The tribe has always been playing and contributing positively, but now it has become part of the conflict. So we could form a committee or a certain framework to develop priorities or mechanism for an actual, genuine reconciliation, not between the governors, but between the different tribes that were subject to the prior disputes. This is one important point. Accountability and whether or not to initiate the TGA process. Of course, no one can initiate or become part of a peace process or a reconciliation while knowing that tomorrow they will be held accountable because they perpetrated something. That won't happen. On top of the overall general framework, of course, some of you mentioned about something about immunity. So that's why we need the reconciliation before launching the peace process. It should be genuine, effective reconciliation, because those who would reconcile, or they know the expectation. But someone who knows up front he will be held liable and accountable, definitely he will not get engaged in reconciliation. So we should start with genuine reconciliation without, of course, jeopardizing or undermining the victims' rights in terms of reparation and the like. But reconciliation needs to be directly engaged in because the peace process would address immunity. Just like in 2011, many people benefited from immunity. So how would you hold them accountable whereas they are immune? And also the other point about the law and the grievances and codifying the violations and the grievances. Yes, something of the like happened in the south. And in Hadramaut in particular, many property houses were nationalization law. Many houses were expropriated. And also the agricultural reform law in Hadramaut. Atrocities. People were dragged in the streets as a result. So But it all happened because it was a law by certain entities, people who are in power. Probably they're no longer in power, but or they are still in power, but they're thinking differently. And now we have still people in power who dragged people in the street, lynching actually, just like the courts of inspection. And they issued the verdict extrajudicially and carried out the execution. So we need a genuine reconciliation before we initiate any other comprehensive peace step, or at least it should be the gateway or the leeway to peace.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I'll make this very brief, I promise. I think we've heard a lot about some of the loftier goals of transitional justice right now, and a lot of concerns around being able to make this happen before there's a genuine peace in Yemen, and being able to achieve a lot of these goals before there's real stability in the country. However, we've also simultaneously heard that the country has been dealing with different forms of conflicts for decades at this point. And there seems to be a disconnect between the need to reconcile with some of these problems and do it quickly, because it has been ongoing for such a long time, and the need to find a genuine peace before doing so. And I would venture to say, unfortunately, you know, there's some people in this room right now who do have the power to do this, who are part of different government institutions, different authorities, et cetera. Some of them have already left. But I will say there at least right now is the opportunity to provide people with reparations, and at least start to work toward making people's lives better who have actually been the victims of some of these violations. That doesn't need to wait. Some warring parties, some people who have committed violations in Yemen have paid people reparations, and I would venture to say that probably has allowed them to move on with their lives, even as they wait for a broader peace. That doesn't need to wait. There's a lot of loftier goals that do need to come in the future, but I think right here and right now, there are still thousands upon thousands of violations that have never been repaired. There's been no discussion of them. There's been no form of any offering from any government authority, and it's often people who have the least in society that are suffering the most from these violations. And so that is something that can be addressed now by many of the people in this room and in this conference in general. Thanks.
Yazid, a final word from you.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا أتفق مع كثير مما طرحه بعض المعلقين أن هناك حالة شديدة من انعدام.
In case of lack of trust, loss of confidence, and the gap is widening on a daily basis. Even vis-a-vis the approach to justice, and the Yemeni case is unique and very complicated and funny sometimes. In Yemen, when the Yemenis thought and agreed on the need for a TJ law, the bill for the TJ law, it was only part and parcel of the law on immunity as one provision in that law. But mind you, the immunity law was one of the key reasons for the reignition of the war and conflict in Yemen. But mind you, justice is a long journey. It's a thorny road, thorny trip. And across the spectrum, as Yemenis in the north and the south, irrespective of our identities and the geographical locations, we have to clinch steadfast, hold steadfast to this glimpse of hope. There is no panacea, and there is no ready-made solution. Like what Judge Rona has said, we need to Yemenize this process in the way that is most fit and proper for our Yemeni context. And that's why it is of paramount importance for us to gather and to develop the way we envision justice up front, not to wait until the conflict ends and then the politicians would superimpose upon us their own versions of justice to best serve their interests. So we need to develop a vision to enable us to overcome what happened during the NDC when the participants disagreed over how far back we should go back in order to hold accountability, or what about the duration of the transitional justice period itself. Because during the NDC, many people said, is it TJ or is it retributional justice with a vendetta? So we need to clinch and steadfast to that hope. It's the only route to sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there any other of the speakers who still want to say one quick word? I think there was one question on America.
Yes, the question on the U.S. in Colombia. Well, first, Trump was not president, it was Obama, so that helped. And secondly, my recommendation is if you ever get to a peace negotiation or if you ever have to build a transitional justice system, make sure you keep the United States out and do it yourself. This is not entirely true in our case because we at one stage the U.S. was very supportive of Colombia and very useful, but they're not very good at negotiations. This is not their thing. And when we needed somebody, we asked them to send a special envoy for particular issues halfway through the negotiation. But more seriously, and it was just that right now, I think that, look, it's obvious that all conflicts are different. I once made a joke for myself, which was that there is something that all conflicts have in common, and it is that everyone thinks they are unique. So it's true, they're all different, but you can learn from others. If you understand they're all different, that's what we did. You learn from others, and then you adjust it to your own situation, and you create your own vision. So I think that in the short term, this is the most important thing for you. And it's not even an issue of passing a law, but of just some basic shared principles. So if society at large agrees, okay, whatever happens, and there may not be a big peace agreement, there may not be a line on the sand that says, okay, this ended, it may be a gradual thing, but you say, whatever happens, it has to at least follow the following principles. We don't want to have a general amnesty, we want to make sure there's as much truth, justice, and reparations as possible. How much we don't know, but this is what we have to agree, that we're going to respond to the victims.
Sure. Thank you very much. Rana, you had one final, but keep it very short, please.
لأنه في سؤال هنا هل إذا ما قامت هيئة التشاور
If the CRC should it conduct self-reflection?
يعني كيف قد بتتأمل؟
We're preoccupied with the conflict. There is no time for reflection and meditation. However, if we want to expand the membership of the CRC, yes, we need more female membership, minority membership, and other components that are not currently represented in the CRC. Yes, I do second this motion. And I believe that do not heavily rely on politicians, particularly when it comes to TJ, because everyone perpetrated a violation among the politicians. And if you depend on them in TJ, they will tell you, well, God is all forgiving, let's forget about it, general amnesty, let's turn on a new page. So that's why the civil society should start from now, preparing the case file, the profile for all cases and violations, contacting the victims. You need to monitor, document, etc. Here comes the role of the civil society in documentation, in monitoring, in preparing or building the case file, and also to propagate genuinely for a genuine TJ law. But if you keep it up to the politicians, they'll say general amnesty, God is all forgiving, let's forget about it, and then we will be starting a new round of conflict once we sign the peace deal. Thank you very much.
Thanking this great panel for this.